True Crime Brewery contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Medical information is opinion based on facts of a crime and should not be interpreted as medical advice or treatment. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to True Crime Brewery. I'm Jill.
And I'm Dick.
Vicki Bader's divorce from her attorney husband Seth Bader was beyond contentious. Alimony and child custody issues persisted well after their breakup. Vicki, emotionally fragile and even at times suicidal, endured months of harassment and gaslighting by Seth and his toxic accomplices. But when Seth decided to involve their oldest son in his campaign to destroy Vicki, things took an ominous turn. Join us at the quiet end for Gaslighting, the Extermination of Vicki Bader. Seth Bader was a terrible human being who would stop at nothing to destroy his ex-wife. After getting custody of their children, he withheld alimony payments, had her tires slashed, and he even cooked her beloved parakeets in her oven. More than anyone, the Bader's oldest son, Joey, was put in the middle of his parents' conflicts. Turned against his mother and living in fear of his father, Joey's life would be upended by his own actions done on behalf of Seth Bader. The plot to kill Vicki Bader included several people, too, who either hated her or expected some financial gain after her death. But sadly, Vicki never imagined that people could be so heartless as her killers were.
So I was waiting for a New Hampshire case because I wanted to drink some Smutty Nose beer. The Smutty Nose Brewing Company, named after one of the Isles of Shoals off of Portsmouth, where there was a murder in the 1800s, which we might do someday.
Yeah, that's a fascinating story.
But I'm going to drink some Old Brown Dog. Now, this is an American brown ale. It's pretty much a classic. It's a very solid beer. Good to have around as an everyday drink. Red-brown color, small off-white head, nice aroma of caramel, and taste of caramel, and nice malt. Very enjoyable, dependable beer.
Okay, that's a pretty good review.
Let's open it up.
All right, open it up. It does smell like caramel. Yummy.
There we are.
Sounds like it has some carbonation too, huh? Fair amount.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That was kind of a sloppy pour.
Well, we're not picky. Bring it on down here to the quiet end and we'll get started. I'm going to have you start us off as usual, because I think this story is not only kind of crazy, the people, the characters in it are just nuts. But poor Vicki, my heart really went out to this woman.
Yeah, well, I was working there when this occurred, working in York, which is like 10 miles away.
Yep.
It was a big case.
Yes, everybody talked about it.
A lot of stuff, yeah. So this is a story about interactions between some very damaged and some very abused people, which ended in the violent death of a 35-year-old mother of three. And this is Vicki Bader. Vicki was born to a middle-class Pennsylvania family. She was the middle child. She had an older brother and a younger brother. Her mother, Lois, was an at-home mom, full-time with her kids. Her father, Jack Busby, worked on postage machines for Pitney Bowes. And to move up in the company, he transferred to a larger office in Dayton, Ohio. And then when Vicki was 10, he moved the family again, this time to a small town on Long Island in New York. This house they had was small, just about 600 square feet. And they had just 2 bedrooms for the family of 5.
Yeah, so it was pretty close. Not a lot of room there.
No.
But Vicki was an honor student. She also played the clarinet in the school band. She was pretty, she was funny, and she was pretty popular. When boys began asking her out on dates, her parents weren't thrilled. But they trusted Vicki. She was obedient and rarely gave them any trouble. She was always home on time, and she wasn't boy crazy like many of her girlfriends were. But then in the mid-70s, when Vicki was a teenager, her parents got a divorce. Jack moved back to Pennsylvania and then eventually to Florida, where he remarried. But less than 3 years later, he died of a massive heart attack at the age of 58. So this was tragic. And Lois, she stayed on Long Island. So as they grew up, both of Vicki's brothers got married in their 20s. The oldest, John, moved to the Boston area, and the youngest, Jim, stayed on Long Island. Vicki moved into an apartment of her own in Smithtown, only about 5 minutes away from her mother. Vicki and Lois remained extremely close, though, and they spoke every day.
Yeah, there's a story shared by Lois in a book written about Vicki's disappearance, titled Legally Dead. Now, the story goes that Lois received an answering machine as a birthday gift from Vicki, and she was really touched to find that Vicki had left loving messages on the machine before giving it to her. To Lois, this was an example of how considerate her only daughter had been. It seemed that Vicki was always thinking about how to make life better for the people in her life.
That is super sweet and thoughtful to do that.
That's kind of nice.
Very nice. When Vicki was 20 years old, she got engaged to a young man who we're going to call David, just to protect his privacy. They'd only dated for a few months, but Vicki was anxious to be in a relationship, and she really wanted to start a family. So Vicki planned her wedding for the spring of 1981. The service and reception were just what she had dreamed of, but the marriage wouldn't be. In the weeks leading up to her wedding, Vicki confided to her mother that she had some reservations about marrying David. Now, Lois liked David, but she certainly didn't want her daughter to be stuck in an unhappy marriage. She knew what that was like. So she told Vicki, "You can back out any time and I'll support you." But despite Vicki's cold feet, she went ahead with the marriage. It wasn't until after they lived together for a while that Vicki realized how different she and David really were. She commuted each day to New York City by train for a good job as a real estate consultant. She earned a great salary and showed potential to be very successful in business. But even though she earned a generous salary, David told her that she needed to live on a $30 a week allowance. He said he wanted to save as much as possible and buy a house as soon as they could. But $6 a day was ridiculous. It wasn't enough for a Manhattan business person, no matter how careful she was with her spending. So she tried to explain and discuss this with her new husband, but he really thought he was in charge. And this disagreement made her realize that the marriage was not going to work. So it only took 6 weeks for the couple to agree to an annulment and move apart.
That was quick, wasn't it? Jeez.
It's better to do it quick, though, right?
Well, sure, but she had misgivings going into the marriage.
She did. It was one of those things where it's all planned and paid for, and she just didn't want to back out. You know, she was certainly young enough to make that kind of mistake.
Oh, yeah. It wasn't until Vicki was 28 years old that she found a new potential love interest. She read a Lonely Hearts ad in the personal section of her local newspaper and answered it. The ad was run by a man who described himself as good-looking and kind. Now, Vicki knew better than to accept a description in a personals ad at face value. And almost on a whim, she called the voicemail box listed in the ad and left a message. She got a quick response. The man told her that his name was Seth Bader. He is a 30-year-old student. And actually, Vicki and Seth had both gone to the State University of New York at Stony Brook on Long Island, but at different times. Seth had studied engineering there, but now he was in law school at Hofstra University.
Yeah, so this is a thing way from the past. There was no picture. There was no online. This was just an ad where there were words, and you could call this number and leave a message and then talk to the person.
Imagine that.
So this was the beginning of, what would you call it, blind dates, that kind of thing. Pre-internet dating.
Yeah.
So on the phone, Seth sounded like a pretty nice guy. He talked very fast, like he was nervous, but the first call went well and they agreed to talk on the phone again. Now, although they didn't live very far away from each other, Seth was in no hurry to meet in person. Their phone calls continued and they became close, speaking just about every day. Seth told Vicki that he was the only child of older parents who were both educators. His mother, Yvette, was a concert violinist. His father, Abram, had 2 degrees in physics. So back during the Great Depression, Abram was broke and he dropped out of Columbia where he was working on his PhD. He'd taken a teaching job at a high school in Queens, and that's just where he ended up. Seth really admired his father, but he'd really disappointed him by showing no interest in physics or music. He'd had piano and violin lessons as a child, but he quit when he was a teen. But he was a smart kid. He graduated from high school early in 1976. He scored in the 99th percentile on the SATs. So at age 16, he enrolled in the State University of New York at Stony Brook to study engineering. Socially, he just didn't fit in with most of the other students who were older and more confident. But he did make one friend who taught him all about guns, and this would become a passion for Seth throughout his life. In fact, for a college assignment, Seth wrote a paper about the rifles chosen by armies and what they can reveal about the countries themselves. The paper went on for almost 100 pages, much longer than what had been assigned. And later, Seth would admit that the paper was self-indulgent, but at the time, he was very, very proud of this.
Now, Seth and Vicki got married in 1991. Neither of Seth's parents were alive to attend the wedding. Yvette died after many years of Alzheimer's disease, and Abram died of cancer. Now, when Vicki first introduced Seth to her mother, Lois just was not impressed.
That's putting it mildly.
She thought he was a piggish little man who spoke too loudly and too much. He was always talking too loud and too fast for meaningful conversations to happen.
Haven't we all known someone like that?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they're just hard to be around.
We got a couple in our family.
Oh, jeez.
One time, Lois served spaghetti to Vicki and Seth when they came over for dinner. And according to Lois, Seth devoured the pasta, then proceeded to lift the plate up to his face and lick the sauce right off the plate.
Can you believe that?
It's a little bit out there.
Yeah. Especially you're not at home.
Right. And you've just met this woman.
Right. Yeah.
Lois was pretty much disgusted. Seth just made all these noises, slurping noises, and then he had the sauce on his face, on his nose. It was a mess.
Yeah, she was not happy about it.
Why are you going out with that guy?
Right, right. And Vicki was really surprised when she learned that Seth liked guns so much. It really seemed out of place for this brainy law student from Brooklyn to be so passionate about shooting. But she humored him, even went along a few times to do target shooting with him. When Vicki married Seth, he just graduated from Hofstra University School of Law. They had a brief honeymoon on the east end of Long Island, and then they moved into Seth's family home in Brooklyn. After their wedding, Seth shocked his new wife by telling her that she owed him $1,500 for her part of the wedding. And at first Vicki laughed. She thought he was joking. Weren't all of their expenses shared now that they were husband and wife? But no, Seth insisted. He said that there had been extras that only she had wanted, and these added up to $1,500, so he expected her to pay him back. So remember, her first husband's attitude toward finances had torn them apart. But this time Vicki gave in and agreed with Seth. She probably just wasn't going to go through a second divorce. At least not that early on.
Not
it's embarrassing.
Early. Well, it is. To spring that on her after the wedding. You know, I'm figuring they were paying for the wedding themselves as a couple.
I would think so, because his parents had died, so he had inherited whatever they had.
Yeah.
Not that they were super wealthy, but they had a home and everything.
So Seth is like, all right, these are the basic things we agreed on, and you wanted to upgrade some things.
Right.
So you got to pay for it.
Well, and you know what's even more interesting, Dick, is why did Vicki choose these two men? Was there something there that pulled her in the beginning that she wasn't quite aware of? Why was she attracted to men like this? Because I don't think that's normal or even common for a man to do that.
Yeah, it isn't.
Yeah. So there's something there about Vicki. Not to say it's her fault, but, you know, there's just something there when you're attracted to people like that. Maybe something from her childhood is what I'm kind of pointing at here.
Yeah, that could be.
Yeah. So just months after the wedding, Vicki was pregnant with twin girls. And they were really happy. Seth very much wanted to be a father, and he believed he could do a better job than his parents had. But he was wrong about that.
Oh, was he ever? In 1991...
Yeah, not long after the wedding.
Yeah, the newlywed time, just about.
Mm-hmm.
A social worker knocked on the Bader's front door. and explained that Joey Fitzgerald, who was Seth's biological cousin, would be taken from his drug-addicted mother and placed in foster care unless a relative took him in. The last time Seth had seen Joey was at a family wedding 2 years earlier. DHS had decided that Joey's younger brother, Matthew, could stay with his mother at a shelter, but Joey could not, and Seth insisted that Joey could move in with him and Vicki. And after all, his family, right?
Yeah, it seems like a great gesture. It's just hard to believe that things went to hell so quickly. Now, Joey had been born in 1982. His father was Bernard and his mother was Jay. When he was 6 years old, his mother was pregnant with his little brother, Matt, and his father was in jail. Jay and Joey went to live with her great-aunt Mildred, and Mildred put family above all else, so she didn't hesitate to help Jay, who really needed her. Jay gave birth to Matthew in September of 1987. But then, not too long after that, Aunt Mildred died. But she left her apartment to Jay and the 2 children, which could have been great, but they were on welfare and they could barely afford the place. And to make matters worse, Jay was addicted to heroin. Joey would later tell social workers that their home always had crack pipes and used syringes lying around. He said that his mother never did drugs in front of him or his brother, but he was quite young when he realized that these bags of yellow powder made his mom too tired to get out of bed or do anything with him or his brother. So Joey began at age 7 to take over the parental responsibilities. He changed Matt's diapers, fed him, and cleaned up the house to the best of his ability. When Joey was 9, his father Bernard was released from jail and came to live with them. But the only reason he'd been released was because he'd been diagnosed with terminal cancer. Can this get any worse? It can, because he was in the hospital within a week and died just days later. So soon, Jay and the children lost the apartment, and they had no home to go to. Just a big mess.
That's a pretty traumatic event, or series of events for this little kid, Joey.
Very sad.
Now, his new life with Seth and Vicki was way better than Joey could have imagined. There were 2 adults who wanted to take care of him. They made his bed, cleaned his clothes. He never had to cook his food or clean the kitchen. He didn't have to take care of his little brother either. Joey would later describe his early relationship with Vicki as affectionate. She read him stories at the same bedtime each night, tucked him in, gave him a kiss on his forehead. Unlike the other adults he had lived with, Vicki didn't seem to have any ulterior motives for taking care of him. She simply wanted to, and believed that he was deserving of love.
So in November of 1991, Vicki and Seth left for a weekend away in Maine, and they left Joey with a responsible relative. Vicki was 6 months pregnant by then, and they had reservations at a motel in Saco. Although she'd been looking forward to the trip, Vicki really didn't feel well. On the car ride, she began to have some pelvic pain, and as they were driving through New Hampshire, still over an hour away from their destination, Vicki began to have a miscarriage. Seth called an ambulance, but it was already too late by then. The loss of the twins was devastating to both Vicki and Seth, and both of them would look back on this miscarriage as a point in their relationship that neither of them would ever overcome emotionally. Now, I'd have to say it was more difficult for Vicki, but it did seem that Seth was really excited about this pregnancy and was very disappointed and sad.
Sure, but Vicki's the one who's carrying the twins, and it's going to affect her a lot more.
Sure.
Now, in the spring of 1992, Seth bought a big, beautiful house in Stratham, New Hampshire. It was located at the end of a cul-de-sac named Doe Run Lane. Seth was the sole owner of the property, which was worth at least $500,000. He got a great deal. He paid just $380,000 for it because the builder had run out of money before completing the construction. There was close to 8 acres of land surrounding the home, with a small creek running through the woods out back. Joey was 10 years old when they moved in, and he couldn't believe how big the house was or how much room there was to play. On moving day, some neighbor kids came over on their bikes to see who had moved in. Now, Joey was a little bit older than these kids, but he was welcomed as an exciting new addition from the big city.
Yeah, and to Joey, it seemed like the move to New Hampshire made Seth and Vicki happy. They'd both been really quiet and sad since losing the twins. Now they began to show each other some affection again. But this was the interpretation of a 10-year-old. In reality, the marriage was still very troubled. Things were not getting better. Joey really loved his little brother Matt more than anyone in the world, because in his head he thought that everyone else would eventually let him down as his parents had, but he knew he would always have Matt. Joey hadn't seen his brother in several months when he asked Vicki if Matt could come and live with them. He thought that Vicki would be more open to the idea than Seth, and Vicki answered as he hoped that she would, saying she'd talk it over with Seth and she thought it was a good idea. And this must have gone well because Vicki told him the next day that Seth had said yes. So within a few weeks, Matt moved to New Hampshire and lived in the bedroom right across the hall from Joey. Joey was very happy about this.
Yeah, but Matt's moving in seemed to have a negative effect on Seth. Joey was clearly Seth's favorite, and Seth would say so right in front of Matt. He said that Joey would grow up to be smart, handsome, and athletic, but Matt would not. Now, in response to Seth's increased displays of affection towards him, Joey found that he wanted less to do with him. Seth was loud, so loud it seemed like he was always yelling. And the more Joey spent time with other kids in his neighborhood and saw how their parents were, the more he disliked Seth. He realized that Seth just was not like the other parents. He was mean, and he was an oddball.
So Seth was admitted to the New Hampshire bar in late 1992. Then he opened a law practice in his home office in Stratham. Seth took on all types of cases, from family law to criminal defense, but he quickly got this reputation as being abrasive and stubborn. Then Vicki returned to work in real estate, and together they purchased some rental properties in Exeter, Portsmouth, and Newmarket, and these are good towns for real estate.
Yes, they are.
By early 1993, Vicki was pregnant again, and she had never seemed so happy to Joey and Matt. This baby was due in August. Joey would be 11 years old then. When Samuel Bader was born on August 7, 1993, Joey knew that there would be some major changes in the family. Sam cried and had dirty diapers like any other baby, but Joey was so relieved that he didn't have to take care of him like he had with Matt. Seth and Vicki then petitioned the court to adopt Joseph and Matthew. Their mother, Jay, didn't object, so the adoptions became official after a hearing in February of 1994. So Joey and Matt changed their last names from Fitzgerald to Bader, and the 5 of them were a family. Seemed like things were looking up.
Yeah, right? They have a family. They have a nice home.
They seem to have everything you could want.
So it seems.
Yeah.
But as the family was supposed to be coming together, Vicki was falling apart. 1 week before the adoption hearing, she started going to therapy. Vicki felt like she needed help with an increasingly hostile husband. Vicki had hoped that having baby Sam would improve their marriage, but it didn't. Seth became impossible to please. He belittled Vicki, called her a fat pig, said he didn't know why he ever married her in the first place.
What a dick, huh?
He is.
Very abusive.
He was terrible about Vicki taking time off of work during and after the pregnancy. He kept track of the bills that arose, and he told her how much she owed him.
Yeah, so the same thing as the wedding, kind of.
Yeah.
Then, in April of 1994, Seth was arrested not once but twice in one night for picking up undercover sex workers and paying them for blowjobs. And this was the final straw for Vicki. She decided that she had to get away from Seth for her own sense of well-being. So in May of 1994, Vicki took her 3 children and a bag of clothes and left the Stratham house. Joey was now 12, Matt was 6, and Sam was just 9 months old. Vicki also took her 9mm pistol with her, which had been a gift from her husband years earlier, but she left no forwarding address for Seth. And being the attorney that he was, Seth Bader went right to court.
Yeah, he hired an attorney he knew, Barbara Taylor, to represent him. Together, they drew up a motion for divorce. Seth accused Vicki of not taking any of Joey or Matt's clothing with her. He also accused her of having no diapers, bottles, formula, or pediatric prescriptions for Sam. Seth then filed for ex parte custody of the children, asking the court to grant him custody without hearing from Vicki. He stated that his wife was suffering from severe depression and that her whereabouts were presently unknown.
So he went right for the throat, really.
He did.
Vicki hired her own attorney who refuted Seth's allegations, and Vicki warned her lawyer that Seth would be relentless. But then suddenly, she told her attorney that she had settled the case with Seth. Seth had typed up a post-nuptial agreement, and the agreement stipulated that Vicki would live in a rental property they owned in Exeter, and Seth would pay the taxes and utilities on that home. She and the boys would all remain on his health insurance, too. And instead of child support or alimony, Seth would pay Vicki $20,000 a year in income from rental properties. Then the boys would split their time between the two homes. So this seemed like a fair, time-saving solution, and they both signed the agreement on June 3, 1994. If only he would stick to it. And there's just so much going on behind the scenes as well. Vicki naively believed that less than 6 weeks after running away from Seth, she would be free from him, but she really couldn't have been more wrong about that.
Now, Vicki had been pregnant again when she left Seth, but in mid-June, she lost the baby. And on June 20th, the court accepted the post-nuptial agreement, and Vicki and Seth were officially divorced. The next day, June 21st, 1994, Vicki asked a babysitter to watch the boys at her house in Exeter. After kissing them goodbye, she drove to a motel in Saco, Maine, got the same room that she and Seth had reserved when she lost the twins, and in that room she took an overdose of Tylenol with codeine.
Now, Vicki does this more than once, and the thing is, people who knew her, friends, her attorney, just didn't understand it. She seemed so together. But it was something, it seems, that Seth was doing to her self-confidence. He was just beating her down so much. And that's something that only Seth and Vicki would know about in detail. That same evening, though, Vicki was rushed to the hospital in Saco, barely conscious. Earlier that day, she'd had a difficult therapy session with her psychiatrist, and it had been so difficult that the doctor tried to call her later and check on her. Vicki had also missed a meeting she was supposed to go to after her therapy session. Phone calls from Vicki's worried friends came into the police, who called her house and spoke to the babysitter. And the babysitter said that Vicki had just called her, so the police were able to trace that call. They called the Saco police, who forced open her motel room door and found Vicki lying on the bed with an empty bottle of Tylenol with codeine nearby. Vicki was admitted to the hospital. She voluntarily agreed to stay for 1 week. Seth heard the news about his ex-wife from the Exeter police while his girlfriend, Mary Jean, was at his house on their second date. So with Mary Jean in the passenger seat, he picked up the boys from the babysitter and he brought them back to Stratham to stay with him. Then, after Vicki was released from the hospital, she and Seth agreed to continue to share custody of the boys, but that they would spend more time with Seth until Vicki felt better. But then, just 1 month after her suicide attempt in Maine, Vicki again took an overdose. She called her doctor herself this time, and he called the Exeter police. They encouraged her to check herself into the Portsmouth Pavilion, a psychiatric hospital just about 10 minutes away from her house. So she did, and this time, while Vicki recovered from her second suicide attempt, Seth prepared his legal attack against her. When her attorney showed her the motions that her ex-husband had drafted, Vicki was angry and really sad. Now Seth was suing her for sole custody of the boys.
Well, if I didn't know everything else about this case, I would say that that's entirely reasonable.
So far,
Seth.
It does sound reasonable, yeah. It really does. But things just go downhill fast.
Yeah, they must have.
And he was really setting her up for this. He was doing things to her. And a lot of it, we don't know exactly what it was. But yeah, I mean, at first glance of what's going on, it does seem reasonable for him to want custody.
Now, in the suit, Seth wrote that Vicki had acted calm and collected earlier in the day when they went shopping for appliances, only to attempt suicide later that day. Seth used this as proof of Vicki's instability. Seth added that he had spoken with her psychiatrist about her condition. Told the court that Vicki had told the doctor that she was having dreams, visions, hallucinations, whatever, that the children she had miscarried were calling to her from heaven. The doctor was concerned that she might attempt to take her living children with her to heaven to join the miscarried children.
That's what he said, but the doctor disagreed with Seth's characterization of his statements. He insisted that his words about mothers taking their children to heaven had just been a general answer to direct questions from Seth, like he'd led him in that direction. He said that his answers were meant only in general terms, and that he had been given Vicki's permission to speak with Seth. Then he added, "I do not think her past psychiatric problems are interfering with her ability to be a highly effective parent at this time." Then Seth's girlfriend, Mary Jean, moved in with him in Stratham. Mary Jean Martin was the prettiest woman Seth had ever dated. She was also very ambitious, to a fault, I'd say. Mary Jean had 2 younger brothers, Stephen and James Paul, and when she was a teenager, her parents divorced. So most of her family moved to Florida, but she decided to stay behind in Massachusetts. Then after high school, she moved from college to college without ever graduating. In the mid-1980s, Mary Jean got married, but that failed. Then in 1989, Mary Jean married a man from Boston named Brian Messenheimer. She raised and showed dogs all over New England, and he worked as a toll collector on the Massachusetts Turnpike until he got hurt on the job and went on workers' compensation. In 1988, they'd had a daughter who they named Courtney. Messenheimer complained that even after the birth of their child, Mary Jean's priority was to spend her weekends going to dog shows. So the two separated within a year, and they shared custody of their daughter.
Mary Jean worked for a personal injury lawyer outside of Boston, where she was a paralegal. She was an asset to the attorney because she knew a lot about insurance. Mary Jean had been an adjuster for Aetna when she was married to Brian Messenheimer. Now, he later claimed that Mary Jean left the company because of irregularities with her paperwork and her sexual relationships with some personal injury attorneys connected to her claims. With her blonde hair and tight skirts, Mary Jean was very popular with the law firm's clients. Seth met her through a personal ad, and he was infatuated with Mary Jean from the very beginning.
Yes, it would kind of grow into an obsession. He spent a lot of money on her, very different from how he had treated Vicki. Mary Jean loved going to concerts and plays, and she would pay for the best seats to plays in Boston's theater district with Seth's credit card. Seth would go with her sometimes, but she often went without him. Another love of Mary Jean's was Disney collectibles. She spent literally thousands of dollars on artwork and figurines. Her relationship with Seth was very up and down, and they had loud, screaming fights frequently. So now the home provided to Joey, Matt, and little Sam was very dysfunctional.
Boy, I'll say, really turned sour fast.
It really did.
Now, while Vicki was hospitalized, Seth still insisted that his ex-mother-in-law Lois take care of the boys during Vicki's scheduled visitation days. Now, Lois enjoyed watching her grandkids, but it seemed hypocritical to her that Seth was fighting in court to keep them from Vicki, while at the same time telling Lois that she needed to assume their care for him. Seth was a pretty negligent parent anyway. Joey told Lois that Seth would spend his days in his office or in his gun room. The only person he gave any attention to was Mary Jean. Joey had to change Sam's diapers and make meals for Matt and himself. On top of that, he had to take care of the dogs.
And that was no small job. Now, Seth had a lab, a Dachshund, and an Akita, but Mary Jean was a dog breeder, and she raised pit bull-type dogs. The SPCA was actually investigating several neighborhood complaints about dogs barking at all hours there. There were crates all over the house. There were often over 30 dogs in the house, and even though Seth had been told that he needed a license to operate a kennel in his home, Seth had insisted that the dogs were all just family pets. But cleaning up after the dogs, letting them out, and feeding them often fell to Joey to do.
On Monday, March 11th, 1996, Vicki called the Exeter police to report finding a metal pipe capped on both ends in her mailbox. There was a red string coming from a drilled hole in the top that was secured with masking tape. So it looked a lot like a fuse attached to a pipe bomb.
Yes.
And a detective drove Vicki to the police station to get a statement while police cruisers arrived to block off the street. Officers went door to door to tell the neighbors to stay in their houses away from windows. 2 police officers entered Vicki's house and looked from room to room. And once they were satisfied that there were no other explosives in the house, they left. Vicki seemed to be very upset, but the police suspected that she was responsible for planting the bomb as a way to get Seth into trouble. There had recently been several other incidents reported by Vicki.
Yeah, so it seems here like Seth was setting her up to look like the crazy one.
Yeah.
Back in early January of 1996, Seth had approached Joey with an idea about Vicki's parakeets. He had been discussing killing Vicki's cat, but he had changed his mind when Mary Jean told him that that was a really sick thing to do. But she was okay with killing the birds. On January 11th, Joey got up and woke up his brother Matt for school. Then he went to Seth's bedroom door and knocked to wake him up. When Seth came out of his room, he handed Joey a note to give to the school office. This was a note to get him released early for a therapy appointment. Once Joey was out of school, he was supposed to meet Seth at a gas station down the street from Vicki's house. So around 1 p.m. that afternoon, Joey went to the school office and handed over his note. Vicki's house was only about a mile from Joey's junior high school. Joey walked to the house that he used to see as this safe, comforting home. But now it was a place where he was planning to commit a crime and terrify Vicki. So he got in through the garage side door and looked for the key that he knew was hidden inside. But the key was no longer there. He knew he couldn't return to Seth without completing his assignment, so he desperately searched under doormats and potted plants, but still couldn't find a key. He tried the front door and the back door, but both were locked. So he checked the windows on the side of the house, and he found one with the latch open. So Joey grabbed a wooden bench from the picnic table on the patio and put it beneath that window. Then he climbed in through that window. After closing it behind him, he searched for Vicki's 2 pet parakeets. He wasn't sure where Vicki kept them, but he found them upstairs in a cage. So he removed the top of the cage and reached in to grab the birds, but they flew around the cage and he couldn't catch them. He then found an old popcorn tin that was decorated red and green for Christmas, and he put the tin next to the opening of the bird cage and flipped them upside down so the parakeets fell into the tin, and then he covered the opening. He then tossed the tin with the birds into the oven. He turned the oven on broil and left the house. Then he walked about 15 minutes back to the gas station, where he told Seth that the job was done.
So Vicki comes home from her job that evening and noticed that it smelled like something was burning. She turned on the kitchen light and saw there was smoke in the air and the oven was on. So she shut off the oven and opened the door. A cloud of dark smoke came out. When the smoke cleared, she saw the round tin lying on its side. Using pot holders to remove it, she looked inside. It took her a little time, but then she realized that the tiny bones and blackened feathers were what remained of her pets. They'd been burned alive.
Now, isn't that horrible?
It's really beyond the pale.
It really is. And I go back and forth about how much can you blame Joey, right? Because his father, the man who's in charge of everything in his life, has pretty much forced him to do it.
Yeah.
So I do feel some sympathy for him as well. So Mary Jean, Seth's girlfriend, often spent time playing pool in a pool hall downtown. She had a few friends there, and they were pretty shady types. One of these men was an Italian immigrant named Sandro Studo. Mary Jean offered him $600 to shoot out the windows of Vicki's house with a BB gun. This was all part of her and Seth's plan to scare Vicki away. The main reason why Mary Jean and Seth did not want Vicki around anymore was financial. Seth didn't want to pay alimony, and Mary Jean wanted Seth to spend all of his money on her alone. So on February 14th, 1996, Mary Jean picked up her friends Sibby Caradonna and Sandro Studo. Vicki was supposed to be at work from noon to 8, so they went over at lunchtime. Mary Jean gave Studo a rifle, and he shot out several windows at Vicki's house with brass BBs. Now they also took an axe pick to Vicki's workplace and slashed her tires and scratched up her paint. Studo was paid $600 for this, but he had no idea that Seth had paid Mary Jean $3,000 for this. Now out of that, she had given her friend Caradonna $1,000 and kept the rest for herself. Caradonna was given money mostly because he had introduced Mary Jean to Studo, and Studo had been desperate to make money.
Joey Bader was feeding the dogs on the evening of March 11th when Seth yelled for him to come to the living room. He's watching the local news on TV. A reporter was broadcasting live from Vicki's neighborhood in Exeter, where a bomb had been discovered in a mailbox. Joey would remember that Seth seemed really happy with this news. It was the pipe bomb he had made in the basement a few weeks earlier. Now that weekend, Mary Jean came back to the house from a dog show, and Joey heard her and Seth talking. Mary Jean told Seth that she had driven her minivan to Vicki's neighborhood with the pipe bomb in the back seat. She had then driven from mailbox to mailbox, putting flyers in each box so that she wouldn't look suspicious. When she got to Vicki's box, she put the bomb inside and drove away.
Yeah, and Mary Jean was really happy when she heard that the pipe bomb was having the desired effect of upsetting Vicki.
So is this a functioning pipe bomb?
I think it was, yes.
So it could be detonated.
Yes, it didn't have a timer, but if it was mishandled, it could be detonated, and it also had a fuse which burned quite quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Mary Jean didn't know that leaving the bomb in the mailbox had set off an investigation by the United States Postal Service. But she did know that Vicki was frightened. And then she prepared for the next step in terrorizing Vicki. Mary Jean went back to Sandro Studo at the pool hall and asked if he would be willing to threaten Vicki face to face. So Studo wasn't comfortable with this job, but then he suggested another friend of his. "What about Danny?" he said. Danny was a very big, intimidating guy. He had piercings in his ears, nose, and mouth. He had bulked up arms with tattoos covering his skin from wrist to shoulder. A lot of people in the pool hall knew him simply as Danny with tattoos.
So Studo asked Mary Jean for $2,000. Mary Jean made a counteroffer of $1,500. I love this. We're bargaining about how much it's going to cost to threaten this poor woman to her face.
Oh, these are just despicable humans. Yeah.
So Studo kept $1,000 of that, gave Danny $500 in order to threaten Vicki. So Danny with tattoos drove to Exeter and parked near Vicki's house. Knocked on the door. When Vicki opened it, Danny said, "Are you Vicki?" When she said that she was, Danny said, "You need to get out of the state." Vicki shut the door and told the man to leave her alone. Then she began to cry.
Unknown to Vicki, several people had seen Danny with tattoos when he walked across her property. Neighbors who'd been concerned by the bomb incident had been on the lookout for any suspicious activity at Vicki's house. So after she reported the incident to the police, these neighbors were able to confirm that a man in a dark car had approached the house and that Vicki was definitely not making this up. Despite the threatening incidents at Vicki's house over the past few months, Vicki was feeling pretty good about her future. Now her chances of winning back custody of at least Sam were good. She met in her kitchen with her lawyer, Heidi Boyek, and they were both really frustrated with the police. Heidi felt that Vicki's past suicide attempts were being used against her. Vicki had told the police everything she knew about bomb making to try and help them. It was stuff she'd learned from her ex-husband Seth. But they treated her having knowledge as very suspicious. Now in Heidi Boyek's mind, it was clear who was behind the pipe bomb and all the other crimes. So sitting at the counter and pouring some coffee, Vicki told Heidi that her doctor thought she'd been misdiagnosed. It was possible that Vicki actually had attention deficit disorder. Now people with ADD don't respond well to anti-anxiety medications much of the time. It can actually make the symptoms worse. So this meant that Vicki's unstable behavior could have been a side effect of her medications.
Yeah, well, even without that diagnosis, I mean, those medications can cause, in just about anybody, those undesirable side effects.
Right, and she'd been through a lot, and she'd been trying different medications.
Yeah.
So you can certainly see, while she'd be at her wit's end much of the time.
On Tuesday, May 21st, detectives and a postal inspector went to Seth Bader's house on Doe Run Lane. They decided to take Seth up on his offer to look at his gun safe and workbench. Now, this is a full 2 months after the bomb had been planted in Vicki's mailbox. So as soon as the investigators rang the doorbell, a cacophony of barks and yelps exploded from inside the house. Seth opened the door, showing them what looked like a puppy mill. There were literally dozens of full dog cages stacked up in the dining room, and more dogs were heard in the basement. The dogs were mainly American Staffordshire Terriers, and these are dogs similar to pit bulls. Seth took the investigators down to the basement and showed them his gun collection. There were 2 separate rooms. One of the rooms had ammunition and containers of black powder. And in the other room, Seth showed them his work area, where he reloaded his guns. Now, he had the tools needed to make a bomb. A drill press, cutting tools, but many of the tools were covered in a thin layer of dust, as if they hadn't been used in several months. So the investigators saw nothing that they viewed as having evidentiary value. Then in the days following the March 11th bomb incident and his initial interview with Exeter police, Seth had dug up a plastic container he'd asked Joey to bury in the backyard, and he had thrown it away. The box contained the remaining mix of black and aluminum powder, the funnel, the fuse, the Vaseline, cobalt drill bit, and books he owned with bomb-making instructions in them.
Yeah, so he'd kind of had it all hidden by then. They'd waited too long.
Yep.
And the police really didn't do a great job here. After the divorce was finalized, Vicki had tried to stay in touch with Joey and Matt. She did love them both as her sons and wanted all 3 of her boys to live with her. But Seth was working really hard to turn Matt and Joey against her. So she wrote to the boys and told them that she missed them, but she didn't hear anything for weeks. Then she was just horrified to find a letter from Joey in her mail. So this letter read, "Dear Fat Ass, I'm sorry I didn't send you a gift for Valentine's Day. I was going to send you some rat poison and pudding, but Seth wouldn't let me. It would be purchased by me secretly and sent to you on Mother's Day, even though I've never thought of you as a mother except as a motherfucker. Although I do think of you as a fat asshole who tried to trick us into loving you. If you cared for us even a little, you'd let us be where we want to be. Get a job so you won't have to make Seth pay you money. And leave us alone. This goes for Matt too. He encouraged me to write this note. I feel also that Sam should not see you because you are a very dangerous person. I don't want to waste too much effort on something like you, so I'm going to end this letter. Hatefully, Joey and Matt."
Well, that's a kick in the face,
Isn't
isn't
that horrible? And it was in Joey's writing, but I think Seth had actually dictated it to Joey. Still, it's horrific. That poor woman. After reading the letter, Vicki cried. Her hands were shaking so much that she had to put the letter down. It was just so hurtful, and along with everything she'd already been through, she was feeling like the whole world was against her.
And Joey, though, began to thoroughly resent the way Seth treated him around the house. He's a teen. He wanted to hang out with friends and meet girls. But living in Seth's house was almost like having no parents at all. Seth was out most nights on dates before he met Mary Jean. He left Joey in charge of his younger brothers. He cooked, cleaned, changed Sam's diapers, and put them both to bed. Then Mary Jean moved in. But instead of getting any help or supervision, Seth and his girlfriend went out, and sometimes Joey had an extra child, that was Courtney, to take care of. And then there were so many dogs. Joey was used to taking care of Seth's 3 dogs, but Mary Jean brought an entire breeding operation with her. The number of dogs fluctuated depending on the size of the litters and the number of puppies purchased. Dog crates were piled in the kitchen, dining room, and basement. Whenever the doorbell rang, the sound of 20 to 30 barking dogs would fill the home. Certainly with that number of dogs, they didn't get enough attention. Mary Jean would sometimes dote over them when she was in Stratham, but when she wasn't there, Seth did nothing. the responsibility for feeding, watering, and cleaning the cages of as many as 60 dogs at a time, that was Joey's job.
And the house had to smell.
Oh.
There's no...
I can't even begin to think about what it would smell like.
Right. So Vicki worked hard on her mental state to get better and to be a full-time parent. She wanted to be ready for her 2-day hearing, which was happening in May. But in April, another letter from Joey arrived in the mail. Vicki wanted to believe that Joey and Matt would eventually come around and come back to her. But she opened the envelope and braced herself for more abuse. And this letter read, "Dear Psycho, everything's been going well, very well, since we have not been seeing you. Can we introduce your dog to our 90-pound hungry Akita? I'm sure he would like some lunch. Chardonnay, Vicky's dog, makes me want to throw up, and you don't deserve a dog like Bandit." And that was Seth's Akita. "I was seriously wondering when the ASPCA is going to take him back, since I think he'd rather be put to sleep than live with you. By the way, when are you going to stop writing to us? We're trying our best to forget you were ever born. I hope you're glad to hear that Matt is happy. He and Mary Jean have built a very strong mother-son bond. We're really one big happy family here. I was wondering, where did you get the idea that we loved or even liked you? Hatefully, Joey." So of course this hurt Vicki to read, but she did know that Seth was behind it and tried to stay hopeful that she would have Joey and Matt back with her someday. The hearing in May was going to be difficult. Seth had hired even more attorneys from another law firm to help his other attorney, Barbara Taylor. The deposition of Vicki by Seth's legal team was vicious. When they got to court, Seth and his team presented suicide notes that Seth had collected from Vicki's house back in January of 1995 and presented it as evidence that she was unstable. They accused Vicki of putting her crushed-up pills in a bowl of pudding with the intention of killing little Sam. The hate mail from Joey and Matt was also presented by Seth as evidence of his ex-wife being unwanted as their mother. But then why would Seth have copies of those letters that had been sent through the mail to Vicki?
Yeah, why?
Right. The answer to that would tell the court a lot. Seth had photocopied the letters in his home office before the boys even mailed them out, so it seemed clear that he was behind it.
Yes, it does, doesn't it?
Yes.
Vicki's attorney was just as aggressive, though. She gave evidence that Seth was a negligent parent. She said all the caretaking of Samuel was done either by Joey or by Mary Jean. Seth did not feed, dress, or bathe his son. The photocopies of the hate mail proved that Seth had instigated the problems between Vicki and the older children. Vicki's attorney, Heidi Boyack, asked for a change in the custody agreement to give more time for Vicki with Sam.
The DHS caseworker assigned to the family spoke with Seth about Sam's care. When she came to pick up the boy one morning, he wasn't dressed, fed, changed, or washed. It was 11 o'clock in the morning, and Seth had kept the toddler alone in his room since he'd woken up. Another time the caseworker arrived and found Sam covered in diarrhea. She asked Seth to bathe and change his son before they left, and Seth held Sam in the kitchen sink and sprayed him down with the faucet hose. Another time, while running late for court, Seth had dropped Sam off at the babysitter's house, leaving him on the floor and yelling out that he had to go. But the sitter wasn't even home, and little Sam had wandered around an empty house alone for several hours until that babysitter got home. So that's pretty horrifying. And what we're saying here is just, a drop in the bucket. There's so much. If you read that book, Legally Dead, there's so many horrible things with that poor baby.
So they were really waging war against her.
Absolutely they were. Now, a few months after that incident with the baby, Seth brought Sam to the pediatrician saying he had a rash. But when the doctor looked at the child's buttocks, he saw what looked like second-degree burns that had already blistered and drained. Seth and Sam's brother Matt were questioned, and Seth said that the burns were there when he got the child back from a visit with Vicki. But Vicki and the guardian ad litem had not seen the burns, and Vicki was not alone with Sam. Joey told investigators that he had no idea how Sam got the burns or why anyone would want to hurt the toddler. The State Division of Child and Youth Services opened up an investigation into the circumstances around the burns and into the condition of the children in Seth's household. The caseworker for the state was frustrated by what she saw as efforts by Seth and his lawyer to interfere with their investigation. So, Seth's starting to see that Vicki might get custody. Things are not going as well for him now.
No, he's figuring he's just going to show up and win, but it's going to be a bit of a battle.
Yes. As a result of the investigation, DHS asked the court for an emergency hearing to hear evidence and decide whether the boys should be removed from Seth's home. And their recommendation was that Sam and the other boys should be placed with Vicki. But the marital master, who was kind of like the judge who does family court stuff, denied the motion to give Vicki custody, saying that her emotional state was still too volatile. So it seems to me the kids should probably not be with either parent.
Yeah, I can see it both ways. You know, Seth is just not into parenting.
He's abusive.
And Vicki's mental state is pretty fragile.
Yes.
So I'd be worried about the boys in either home.
I would, but a lot of me feels like Vicki would have been fine if he and his cronies would leave her alone. So in the New Hampshire courts, judges don't usually hear these divorce or custody cases. They're presided over by what they call marital masters. And these are like mid-level judicial officials. But they can review evidence and make rulings in cases. So, the master here was in agreement that Seth didn't appear to be in any condition to take care of Samuel. Family Services suggested foster placement for all 3 boys, but the master didn't have the authority to take that action. So a full hearing would have to be held in order to determine the long-term placement of the boys. Seth and Vicki's attorneys, Barbara Taylor and Heidi Boyack, met in late June of 1996 with the judge who would be presiding over the final hearing in the case of Bader versus Bader. The judge suggested that Vicki settle for alimony and insurance coverage for 3 more years, and that Seth should give the Exeter home to her outright. He said the guardian ad litem was preparing a final report, but he saw no reason why Vicki could not have regular, unsupervised visits with Sam and resume joint custody of all 3 children. The attorneys said they'd go back to their clients and discuss the terms to come up with a settlement. For Seth, this meant he was losing. He took Mary Jean on a 2-week vacation to Florida in mid-July. They brought along Joey, Matt, and Sam, and Courtney, and spent most of the time at Walt Disney World. And the rest of the vacation they spent in Naples near Mary Jean's parents. Just before they left, Seth got the final recommendation from the guardian ad litem, who'd found that there was no further reason for Vicki's visits with Sam to be monitored by a third party, and who would be suggesting to the judge a full reinstatement of Vicki's parental rights. So this, along with the judge's plan to rule in favor of alimony and giving the Exeter house to Vicki, really was sending Seth into a rage. On the vacation, he just kept complaining about how Vicki had screwed him over and how much this was going to cost him. So that's a fun vacation.
Heck yes. So in Orlando, the kids had fun. This was the first time in a long time that they had any fun. Mary Jean bought more Disney collectibles. While swimming in the pool, Seth took a picture of 14-year-old Joe holding Mary Jean in his arms. They had 2 adjoining rooms at the hotel. All the kids were in one room. Seth and Mary Jean were in the other. At night, lying in the quiet of their hotel room, Seth told Mary Jean his plan for murdering Vicki to get rid of her for good. Now she listens to this and says, oh yeah, it's a great idea.
I think she's, pretty much just as bad. In some ways worse even.
Now, in the morning of Monday, August 26, 1996, Vicki's attorney, Heidi Boyack, called the Exeter police to report that Vicki was missing. One of Vicki's neighbors said she'd spoken with Vicki on Friday, but hadn't seen her since. Now, the desk sergeant recognized Vicki's name from the pipe bomb incident, and so he called detectives. And Boyack told the detectives that Vicki had been in good spirits when she last spoke with her. Neighbors said she had left messages on Vicki's answering machine, and the weekend newspapers were piled up at the end of her driveway. She had let herself into Vicki's house with a spare key, and so that Vicki's cat, Q-Tip, had been left outside.
Yeah, which is something that Vicki would not do. Vicki had told this neighbor that she planned to take Sam to spend the night with a friend in Franklin, New Hampshire. When contacted, Seth said Vicki was supposed to have met him and Sam at the pediatrician's office in Portsmouth on Monday afternoon, but when he arrived with Sam, Vicki wasn't there. Seth also said that Vicki was supposed to take Sam with her after that appointment. He said the last time he'd seen Vicki was Saturday, August 24th. She dropped Sam off around 4 or 5 and left. And he said there was nothing unusual about the handoff that day. When detectives entered Vicki's house, her bed was unmade, but it didn't look like anything violent had happened there. They confirmed that Vicki and Sam had spent Friday night, August 23rd, at the home of her friend in Franklin, New Hampshire. The friend said the visit had been good. Vicki had brought a bottle of wine, but they never ended up opening it. They had stayed up late talking about their lives. The bomb incident, the vandalism, and threats were really weighing heavily on Vicki's mind. But Vicki had said she was looking forward to the future, planning her life once her custody case was finally settled. Vicki said that she wanted to sell the house in Exeter and move in with her neighbor while she improved her financial situation. So she's making some plans. Then on Saturday night, August 24th, 2 days before Vicki was reported missing, a Seabrook police officer was cruising down Route 1 when his headlights highlighted a blue Cadillac Coupe de Ville in a strip mall parking lot. It was parked facing out toward Route 1, just a few feet from the road. Now, the primary store of this plaza was an adult bookstore called Leather and Lace, so the officer thought maybe it had just been a customer who didn't want his car seen right in front of the adult bookstore. But then on Monday, August 26th, the same officer was on another patrol in the area when he passed Leather and Lace and again noticed the blue Coupe de Ville in the same odd parking spot. He still didn't find anything suspicious about the car, though, so he didn't stop and look at it, and he didn't run the plate.
Then on Tuesday evening, August 27th, Seabrook police were called to the plaza by the owner of Leather and Lace. He had reported an abandoned car in the store's lot. The police inspected the Coupe de Ville from the outside, did not touch it. The owner had already taken some odds and ends from the car and found the keys inside. The police ran the Cadillac's plate and learned that the car had been listed on a BOLO, or Be on the Lookout, in Exeter. Dispatcher told the police at the scene that they suspected the vehicle could be connected to a homicide. So the car's photographed and taken to the police lot for further examination.
Right. And Vicki's mother, Lois, met with detectives at Vicki's house in Exeter. Lois had flown up from New York to wait for Vicki. She was nervous, but holding it together. Lois was polite, but she knew that Seth was responsible for her daughter's disappearance. Of course, she didn't know how, but she knew deep inside that Seth had killed her daughter. And she said she was going to stay at the house until Vicki was found. So after Seth and Mary Jean had returned from Florida, they transitioned their plot of terrorizing Vicki into a plot to kill her. Mary Jean went back to her old pool hall hangout to see Sandra Stuto and Danny with tattoos. Mary Jean was smiling when she asked whether they knew anyone who could get a gun with a silencer. These two men didn't know anyone. Then Mary Jean asked if they'd be interested in killing the lady. That's what they called her. The man, meaning Seth, she said, is willing to pay $25,000 for both of them to do the job. She said she'd pay them half now and half after it was done.
Yeah, so Danny with tattoos said, I need time to talk to Stuto privately about it. Neither of them was interested in committing murder, so they were about to turn her down. Then Stuto came up with an idea. He told her they would do it for $50,000, half now, half later. So Mary Jean said she'd have to check with the man. And after Mary Jean left, Danny with tattoos asked Stuto what's going on. Stuto said they could take the $25,000 up front and then back out. Mary Jean, or the man, certainly wasn't going to report this to the police. Just no honor among thieves, is there?
No. So just 2 days later, Mary Jean returned, and she said no to the $50,000, and there was no counteroffer. But then she asked Studo if he would at least be the driver. She said he wouldn't have to see the body, just drive Vicki's car and leave it somewhere. The man would shoot Vicki himself. Studo asked for $10,000 to do that job, and Mary Jean said he'd get $8,000. So they had a bargain.
Yeah, so Studo went shopping on Saturday, August 24th, 1996. The day before, he'd visited Mary Jean, and she'd given him $6,000 in $100 bills. She explained the payment was less than $8,000 now because Studo had borrowed some money from her before, and this would take care of the debt. Studo bought a pair of black leather gloves. He didn't want to leave any fingerprints in the car. Studo wore black jeans and a black baseball hat. He also wore 2 plaid shirts and dark sunglasses. His plan was to throw away the hat, gloves, and outer shirt after he was done, and then he'd go to work at his uncle's pizzeria, just as if nothing happened.
Yeah. So Mary Jean picked up Studo in Massachusetts in her minivan and drove him to Stratham, New Hampshire. She took him through some seacoast towns where they looked for lots where they could leave Vicki's Cadillac. They would park Mary Jean's van a short distance away so Studo would have a way to drive back to Massachusetts after Vicki was dead. On the ride to Stratham, Mary Jean gave Studo directions to the leather and lace lot. Seth picked them both up in his Trans Am, and they left Mary Jean's minivan at the leather and lace lot. Seth pulled into his driveway, and Joey Bader was sitting quietly on the outside steps. Mary Jean went into the house first, followed by Seth. Studo was looking around for the blue Cadillac, but it wasn't there, so he was surprised. Then Mary Jean came back outside with Matt, who was like 7 years old, and the two of them got in the Trans Am and left without saying anything to Studo. So Studo and Joey followed Seth down to his gun room in the basement, where Seth pulled out a double-barrel pump-action shotgun with a wooden handle and gave it to Studo. Now Studo was confused and nervous. He was only supposed to drive the car. But Seth told him that Vicki would be arriving at 4 p.m. and that he was going to shoot her, but in case he missed, he wanted Studo to be his backup. Studo shook his head and tried to hand back the gun. Seth then pulled out his handgun and began gesturing with it and talking really fast. So Studo wasn't sure if he was being threatened. English wasn't his first language, but he felt like he was being threatened. Seth told Studo to wait inside his office and listen for a gunshot. If Vicki was still alive, it was his job to block her escape from the front door. So Studo right then thought about running away, but then he convinced himself that he'd be shot in the back by Seth if he tried to run away. So Studo followed Seth down the hall to the office, where Seth left Studo alone and closed the door. Seth's murder weapon was a pistol with an interchangeable barrel. It had a long .22 caliber barrel that made it look like a rifle. Seth planned to change the barrel after shooting his ex-wife. He told Joey he didn't want the marks on the bullet to show that his gun had been used. So he's pulled Joey into this very deeply as well. Seth and Joey stood on the stairs leading to the second floor because it gave them a view of the windows of the front door. Vicki's blue Cadillac pulled into the driveway at 4 o'clock. She was supposed to drop off Sam. Seth ran to his position. Through the blinds in the office window, Studo watched the Coupe de Ville pull up to the house. He moved to the office door and leaned against it, listening. Studo then heard a woman in the front doorway before all the dogs started barking. He was able to hear her walking past the office and down the hallway that led through the kitchen and into the living room. Vicki was wearing green shorts, white shoes, and a flowered shirt. Joey stepped outside and left the front door open. He reached into the back of Vicki's car and took Sam out of his car seat. Then he said to Vicki, "Seth wants to talk to you in the living room." So Vicki took her purse out of the car and walked up to the front door.
And Joey would later say that he wanted to warn her, but he was afraid of what could happen to him. He couldn't look, so he turned away from the house, carrying his 3-year-old brother in his arms, and he waited in the side yard. Vicki didn't say goodbye to Joey or her baby Sam. She had no reason to doubt that she would see him on her way out. Vicki could have gone through the dining room to the living room, but the door was closed, and a pack of dogs were barking in there. So she went to the right, passing the closed door to Seth's office. She walked down a hallway toward the kitchen with her purse over her shoulder, unaware that her ex-husband was watching her. The laundry room door opened quietly as Vicki passed by, and Seth stepped out with his pistol, pointed it at her head, just inches away from her right ear. And from the position of the gunshot wound, Vicki probably never heard anyone behind her.
Well, yeah, plus you've got all those dogs.
Yeah, and they're woofing away. You couldn't hear anything.
Yeah.
So from the position of the gunshot wound, Vicki probably never heard anyone behind her. Seth pulled the trigger, and boom, Vicki fell to the floor dead. So Studo opened the office door and walked out. He saw Vicki lying in the hallway, on her side, one arm stretched out under her head. There was some blood on her right temple. Seth was standing over her body with a gun in his hand. He was wearing large red ear protection like you would wear at a firing range. Seth went downstairs to the basement and came up with a new barrel for his pistol. Studo ran to the front door and called for Joey, who was pacing nervously outdoors. Joey had never heard the shot or the dog's bark. Joey carried Sam upstairs and into his bedroom on the third floor. There was a baby gate he used to keep Sam in the bedroom while they removed his mother's body from the house.
Seth was squatting over his ex-wife, and he told Joey to clean up the blood and put a trash bag over Vicki's head. Even though it had been an up-close shot to the head, the crime scene was very clean. The bullet wasn't powerful enough to exit her skull, so there was only a small pool of blood that was oozing from the wound. Joey went and got a bottle of cleaner and some paper towels from under the kitchen sink. He put on a pair of rubber yellow dishwashing gloves. Seth took the shotgun from Studo and returned it to the basement, while Studo helped Joey clean up the blood. So Studo, Joey, and Seth put Vicki's body in Seth's Jeep. Then Seth called Mary Jean to tell her it was done and she could come back home. Studo took the keys to the Cadillac and drove it to the leather and lace parking lot. Then Joe and Seth waited in the living room for Mary Jean to come back. There was no visible blood spatter. In 5 minutes, Mary Jean showed up with Matt and some groceries. As she and Matt brought the food into the house, Joey went to get Sam from his room. Mary Jean then took Sam and Matt and put them both in the Trans Am. Seth and Joey got into the Jeep and drove the route they'd taken earlier in the week when they had pre-dug Vicki's grave. They did make one stop on the way. In the back of a strip mall, Seth told Joey to throw away the bag with bloody paper towels and rubber gloves, so he threw it in a dumpster. Mary Jean was taking Sam and Matt to do some school shopping in Massachusetts, while Joey and Seth disposed of Vicki up in the Maine woods.
Yeah, at the gravesite, Seth walked along a pebbled path that in the spring would be a stream, but now in late summer it was dry. Seth put the gun in the ground and stomped on it, pushed it down with his foot until it disappeared in the mud. He also had a .30 caliber bullet, which he stomped underground near the gun. It took an hour for Joey to fill Vicki's grave. Seth told him to place some logs on top of the site so animals wouldn't dig up her body. Thoughtful guy. He then made a call on his car phone to Mary Jean to let her know they were done. So after crossing from Maine into New Hampshire, Seth drove to the Fox Run Mall. He bought Joey a pair of green corduroys, tan shirt, and a new pair of shoes. He also bought a new pair of jeans for himself. They changed in the mall and threw out the clothes they'd been wearing in a trash can outside Sears. It's almost 8 o'clock by the time they left the mall. So Seth drove the Jeep to Portsmouth and parked in the downtown district. Seth and Joey ate dinner at the Library, a very popular and fairly expensive steak place.
Yep. After Vicki's disappearance in August of 1996, life at Seth Bader's house did not improve. Vicki was gone, yes, but she was still a big part of Seth and Mary Jean's lives. They were both interviewed about her disappearance several times, and Seth's money situation was no better either, because the court ordered him to put all of Vicki's alimony payments into escrow. Now, Mary Jean was upset. She couldn't believe that Seth was still spending money on Vicki. She was so angry. Angry at Vicki, even though poor Vicki's dead.
Yeah, and until they know that, and as far as the court's concerned, she's alive, and Seth has to keep making payments.
Oh, sure, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
I don't know why they didn't think of that. He's an attorney. But then one evening, a TV crew knocked on Seth's door and asked for an interview. He did agree, but he was really nervous, and his hands were shaking. So the next day, the reporter called up the state police to give them a copy of that video. So now Seth was living from paycheck to paycheck, just waiting for client fees and settlements to pay his bills. He even took a loan from Mary Jean for $70,000. Now, ironically, that had been his money at one time. Seth became really friendly with Mary Jean's friend, Sibby Caradonna then, after she had convinced Seth that Sibby was gay and had no romantic interest in her. Now, while cruising the boardwalk in Mary Jean's Trans Am that August, Caradonna had gotten a ticket. And then in November, just before his court date, he'd called Seth and asked if he would help him fight the ticket. And Seth had agreed, and then the two had become friends. So, I mean, he wasn't there at the murder, but he must have had some idea, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Then in November, after a domestic violence call to Seth's house, Mary Jean was picked up by the police for hitting Seth. She claimed that Seth had attacked her in the past, trying to push her out of the car. There was no way she was going to leave her daughter with him, she said, and she needed to get Courtney out of his house before she left. I think Seth killed his ex-wife, she said. When asked how she knew that, Mary Jean backed up a little bit and said, "Oh, it's just a feeling I have."
Right, because she's pretty deep into it herself.
Yeah, she sure is.
But instead of arresting Seth for murder at that point, the police charged Mary Jean with breaking the state's domestic violence law. A restraining order against her would be issued, and she wouldn't have any future contact with Seth. Mary Jean was then allowed to take her daughter somewhere else for the night. But the officer did call detectives at the Exeter police station the next day and told them that during her arrest, Mary Jean had said some interesting things about Vicki Bader's missing persons case. So the Exeter investigators asked Mary Jean to repeat the statements she had made about Vicki's whereabouts. Mary Jean told them that several times in August, around the time Vicki went missing, she noticed Seth's Jeep was covered in mud. He said he had gone to Maine. "In my heart, I thought that Seth killed Vicki," she said. Mary Jean pointed to the $70,000 debt Seth owed her, and she implied that the money may have been used to pay for Vicki's killing. But Mary Jean had to choose her words very carefully because she knew a lot more than she was letting on. So by the time we get to the end of 1996, Joey Bader's really getting tired of Seth. Seth and Mary Jean were off and on, and they were fighting more than ever. During one fight, when it looked like Seth was going to hit Mary Jean, Joey had intervened and struck Seth in his head. He was then taken out of the home and committed to the juvenile psych unit at Portsmouth Pavilion for 2 weeks.
On December 15, 1996, Joey was interviewed at the state police barracks. He said he didn't know anything about Vicki's disappearance, even though he was one of the last people to see her. Joey had been released from the pavilion on December 11th. Seth had visited him twice, saying he could come home if he promised to do everything he was asked to do. Joey was anxious to leave by Seth's second visit, so he agreed to those terms.
Yeah.
But while Joey had been committed, Mary Jean had been talking to the police. She had been arrested for filling illegal drug prescriptions, and Mary Jean had agreed to tell the police what she knew about the conspiracy to kill Vicki. She had shared enough details to make investigators hopeful that they could get other people to talk. They told Joey that Mary Jean had claimed Joey was part of a conspiracy to kill Vicki in Seth's home, and that Mary Jean had not been allowed in the home while they removed Vicki's body and cleaned up the house. Joey said, "I don't know nothing about that."
Yeah, he's in quite a spot there. Now, Seth was arrested on January 4th, 1997, but this was for endangerment of a child. He had parked in the lot of Riley's, a big firearms dealer, and a woman approached the parked vehicle and saw 3-year-old Sam sitting alone in the back seat. The engine wasn't running and it was freezing outside. She called the police, and the officer who responded found the Jeep's door locked. By then, the boy in the back seat was yelling and screaming. So the officer went into Riley's and asked for the driver of the blue Jeep. Seth Bader was there in the back of the store. Seth said, "Oh, I've only been in the store for 5 minutes," and that he forgot anyone else was in the car. And when the officer told Seth, "I know you've been in there at least 20 minutes, Seth didn't argue. So the officer wrote him a summons and referred this case to the Children's Services, which we know he was already in trouble with them for the way he treated Sam. That burn thing was never really explained, but I feel like he did that to try and get Vicki into trouble.
Yeah.
Can you imagine the pain that little baby went through? He had these horrific burns, and he was just getting Neosporin put on them until he finally got to the doctor, who sent them to the hospital. So in the end of March 1997, Seth and Joey had a conflict, and Seth sprayed Joey with pepper spray. When Joey went back to school, the teacher noticed that his face was red and puffy. So Seth was arrested on Thursday, April 4th, 1997, for this assault on Joey, and he was held on $500,000 bail. So this seemed like a lot, but reporters remembered that Seth had publicly identified himself as the last person to see his ex-wife before she disappeared. And the circumstances of her disappearance were definitely suspicious. Now, despite the interest by the media, the police downplayed any connection between the assault case and Vicki's unsolved disappearance. At Seth's arraignment, the judge reduced Seth's bail to $5,000 personal recognizance, and he spoke to reporters. Seth denied using a firearm or threatening his son, because Joey had also said that he pointed a gun at him. But Seth seemed to be in control, and he was really almost defiant and almost happy just to be getting attention. He liked it when the reporters tried to speak with him, even though he was guilty of so much. It's pretty crazy.
Very much so. So 1 week later, Joey Bader called the detective who was handling Vicki's case. He and his brother Matt had been living apart from Seth, and on the phone, Joey said, "I think I want to talk now." The detective, who had been about to go to sleep for the night, got up, got dressed, and drove to pick up Joey.
He did it right away because he was so excited that Joey was going to talk.
Yeah.
He was certain that Joey had some information about Vicki.
Right.
And at this point, it had been 7 months, and he felt like he was finally going to learn what happened to Vicki Bader.
That's right. So Joey was taken to the state police barracks in Exeter, and he signed a form acknowledging his Benoit rights, which is New Hampshire's juvenile equivalent to the Miranda rights. So they had a detailed map of the state of Maine, and after purchasing the map, Joey said that he was sure Vicki was buried southwest of a fire tower on a dirt path off of a country road. He circled locations on the map that matched what he remembered. He said that he and Seth had traveled there twice that week in August, once to dig the grave and once to bury the body. After one turn off in Maine, Joey told the detectives, "That's it, McLucas Road. That's the name." So about 150 yards in, the road turned to dirt, and there were 2 small ponds on either side and a campground on the right. The campground was closed for the season, so the car came to a fork in the road, slowed down to a stop. Joey's sitting quietly, and he pointed to the dirt trail on the right side of the road and said, "It's 1/10 of a mile down that way."
Yeah, so this was 2:30 in the afternoon when they reached the spot in the road where Joey said they should stop walking. The dry summer bed that had run parallel to the road was now a flowing stream. "This is it," Joey said. "The gun, bag, and gloves are buried right under that stream." He then pointed to a small mound right off the path, and while the ground had not completely thawed from winter, there were small holes in the pile, likely dug up by field mice. Looking down through one of those little holes, a detective could see something green-colored under there. That would turn out to be Vicki's shorts. So the ground had to be thawed before Vicki's body could be recovered. Crime scene unit workers set up tents and space heaters. It took about 24 hours before they could begin digging. Using metal detectors, investigators also recovered the gun and bullet that Seth had buried beneath the stream. So Vicki Bader's body was taken to Augusta, Maine, where they were able to make a positive ID using her dental records. Her autopsy would show that there was a small hole in Vicki's skull, behind and slightly below her right ear. So anything smaller than a .32 caliber bullet could have made that hole. X-rays of her skull showed no bullet, but there were traces of fine gray soft metal consistent with lead inside of her head, and there was no exit wound. At 9 p.m. on the evening of the autopsy, a New Hampshire State Police Major Crime Unit detective sat down with Seth Bader at the State Police Barracks. He told Seth he had important information to share about his ex-wife's disappearance. The detective said, and I'm paraphrasing here, "There's one thing I've learned as an investigator, Seth, and that is that everything happens for a reason. As an investigator, answering the questions of the who, what, and where something happens is pretty easy to figure out through interviews and evidence. But figuring out why, that's the real challenge." So the detective made it clear to Seth that he had spoken with Mary Jean, Sandro Studo, Danny with tattoos, and Sibby Caradonna. Then he showed Seth a photo of Vicki's recovered corpse. He showed Seth a second photo of a hole in the ground in which there was a long .22 caliber gun barrel. He asked Seth if this type of barrel would fit a gun Seth owned, a Thompson Contender. Seth was arrested right then and there. And as they cuffed him, he asked for a candy bar, which was weird.
Well, maybe his blood sugar was a little low.
I suppose. I mean, he's really lacking human feeling. He's kind of a sociopath. So while Seth was held in jail, he didn't keep his mouth shut. He spoke with bravado and pride about how he had shot his ex-wife to death and buried her in the Maine woods. So that would certainly work against him.
I would think.
And his fellow inmates owed him nothing.
Nope. In December 1997, Joey agreed to enter a plea of true to a juvenile delinquency petition. He confessed to assisting in helping Seth murder Vicki. At Seth's trial in April and May of 1998, Joey testified against Seth for 4 days. His testimony was that Seth and Mary Jean plotted to murder Vicki. He also said that Seth hired Sandro Studo to assist and to get rid of Vicki's car. Joey said that he did not witness the murder, but he was called back into the house after the murder to help clean up the blood. Then he helped Seth in transporting and burying Vicki's body.
The prosecutor had records of Seth's mobile phone, which showed calls from Maine on the day of Vicki's death. Credit card records showed that Seth's card was used to purchase pants, shoes, and other items at the Newington Mall that evening. Seth didn't testify in his trial, but the prosecutor played a recording of a police interview where Seth admitted that he may have driven with Joey to Maine that day, but he did it because the weather was good. And he denied any involvement in Vicki's murder. Studo testified that he, Mary Jean, and Seth met that afternoon and agreed that he would dispose of Vicki's car after the murder, leaving it in front of the adult bookstore. He also testified that in Seth's house, Seth shot Vicki.
Vicki's attorney testified about Seth's aggressive acts to reduce his financial obligations to Vicki and to get custody of the children. In tapes of his phone calls with Vicki, Seth talked about his obsession with Mary Jean and his fear she would leave him unless he won the custody and alimony litigation. Vicki's physician testified that Vicki had told him that she remained overweight so that her body would be difficult to move if she were killed.
Yeah, so it's another one of these cases where she was predicting it. Isn't that sad?
Very. What a thing to say. I'm staying obese so you can't move my body very easily.
That's what she said, and actually they did have a hard time moving her body, so it came true. That poor woman.
And the housekeeper testified that she had overheard Seth and Mary Jean say that they wished Vicki was dead.
Well, the defense team tried to discredit Joey and Studo, pointing out that Studo had made a deal for just 5 years in prison and that Joey was going to do no prison time. They also offered evidence of Mary Jean's deceptive character, and they suggested that she and Joey had a sexual affair and plotted Vicki's murder together. Joey was only 14. In the closing, the defense offered an alternative theory that without Seth's involvement, Mary Jean had convinced Joey to do the killing, and that both Joey and Mary Jean stood to benefit from killing Vicki and framing Seth. So at his trial, the judge had let Seth's attorney cross-examine Joey. He admitted that his plea agreement meant that he would not be incarcerated even for 1 second, and that the disposition hearing in his case would not occur until after Seth's trial. Also, the juvenile court would know about his testimony in Seth's trial. But Joey said that he had not made any agreement to testify, and the jury believed Joey. Seth Bader was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy to murder. He was given a life sentence. And, of course, he appealed to the hilt, and the New Hampshire Supreme Court affirmed his conviction. Seth really expressed little emotion after the jury's decision. Didn't even care about the children. In the days after his conviction, he gave interviews for television and newspapers and continued to proclaim his innocence. There's an old joke that says the operation was successful, but the patient died, and that's kind of what happened at the trial, he said. The trial was successful, but the wrong person was convicted.
What a scum.
He really is scum. The court ruled that the conspiracy indictment against Mary Jean would be dismissed without prejudice, but this did preserve the state's right to file charges against her in the future. But wow, she really got away with a lot.
I think so. So Vicki's mom, Lois, waited for the Attorney General's office to make a move, but they never did. In 2001, Lois visited the New Hampshire Attorney General to request he reinvestigate Mary Jean. Another new prosecutor was assigned to the case. Nothing came from it. Lois was later quoted saying, "She's walking around enjoying her life. I feel she got away with murder."
She absolutely did. But much of the evidence against Mary Jean is within statements that are inadmissible against her. So it is almost impossible to use them. A charge based on the facts filed against Mary Jean would be open to many legal challenges before trial, and it would rely a lot on the testimony of these other convicted criminals. So without the cooperation of Seth Bader, taking her to trial will likely never happen. As incredible as her claims seem, that she didn't take part in the conspiracy, that she didn't ask people to slash tires or shoot out windows, that she didn't know what the money being passed back and forth was for, that she didn't sell Vicki's jewelry in the pool hall, that she didn't steal prescription pads or illegally possess prescription medications, that she didn't solicit anyone for murder, and that she didn't know who built the pipe bomb or how it got in the mailbox. She stuck to all those claims. So Mary Jean, of course, is innocent until proven guilty by a court of law. The people who knew of her involvement were all guilty of crimes of their own. So now Mary Jean is believed to be living in Central Florida, where she's still raising and showing dogs.
Sibby Caradonna pleaded guilty to charges in connection with the pipe bomb incident. The plea required him to serve up to 4 years behind bars. Part of the deal included his agreeing to testify against Mary Jean at her eventual trial, if she were ever to be indicted. Vicki's mom Lois's civil suit against Seth Bader was finally heard in 2004. Seth refused to sit in the courtroom for the trial. After all the evidence was presented, the judge found that Seth's actions were wanton, malicious, and/or oppressive, and had caused his ex-wife to suffer to an unimaginable degree. The estate of Vicki Bader was awarded $4.4 million. Although Seth's assets did not total that amount, they still were significant. They included all his real estate and the Steinway piano and Guadagnini violin his mother had left him. So the money is awarded to Vicki's heirs, Joey, Matt, and Sam.
Yeah, and a lot of people have had a problem with Joey being awarded any of that. But he was only 14 and he was told to do this. So I do lean towards sympathy towards him.
Well, and he was important in convicting Seth.
Absolutely, he did do that, yes.
So by late 2010, Seth finally conceded to selling off some of his property to pay the debt. Lois wrote a letter to Seth in prison, expressing all of the anger and sadness he caused her. Lois remains very protective of all three boys. In the years following Vicki's murder, Sam was adopted by a new family and his name was changed.
Yeah, so Joey never spent time in a correctional facility, but he did have court hearings to track his behavior and progress until he was an adult. Lois has said that she feels sorry for Joey Bader. She recognizes that Seth put him in an impossible situation, but she also realizes that now he's a very troubled person. Joey Bader kept his last name, and he has admitted that his feelings for Vicki changed after her suicide attempts. Despite the lack of emotion he showed at the time, Joey has said that the consequences of August 24, 1996 will continue to be with him every day of his life. Seth has lost and exhausted all of his appeals, but his lawyer does continue to search for new ways to get a new trial. And I guess he's pretty busy in prison doing legal things for other prisoners.
Yeah, well, he is an attorney.
Yeah, but isn't that quite a story?
It is. I just remember what a lot of coverage of the murder and the trial and everything at the time. It was a pretty big deal for us little yokels in Maine.
It's just amazing all they did to this poor woman, and then they finally ended up killing her. I mean, she was just treated so badly. And of course, she's not the only victim here. We've got those children and her mother. Just goes on and on. So I'm just happy Seth is in prison at least. But that Mary Jean, just hate her. How awful.
Yeah, she's a lovely lady.
Well, and just the way she treated her dogs, too, really pisses me off. So TCB's music was produced by Mike McClellan, and you can find out more about his work by going to his website, podcastps.com. As we're segueing into feedback, I'd like to ask our listeners to help us out by leaving a review on iTunes or wherever you listen. If we can get some new reviews, that can help us get new listeners. It does take a couple of minutes, but we really appreciate it if you could make that effort. Also, if you have comments, a case suggestion, or a beer recommendation, send us an email to truecrimebrewery@tiegrabber.com or leave us a voicemail. There's always a direct link in our show notes, and there's also a widget on our website, which you can click on and you can record your voicemail from whatever device you're using. If you'd like to support our show and get ad-free and bonus episodes, you can also check out our website, tiegrabber.com/subscribe, and see what the subscribing options are. We also have a similar option on Patreon, and you can look into that by going to patreon.com/tiegrabber.
It's time for listener feedback.
So our first voicemail is from Karen with a case suggestion.
Hi, my name is Karen. I'm a new member, been listening for a while. I'm very curious on learning more of the Sherry Lindsay murder. Dick, I'm very sorry. I know it's a child murder and those are hard. It's hard for me as well, as I have a son that has been murdered. This is a big case that happened in 1984 in Binghamton, New York. Everybody knows about it, refers to it. I didn't move here till 2001 to upstate Binghamton, New York, so this is new to me. I'd love to hear your take. Thank you so much and have a great day.
Well, first of all, Karen, I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you for calling in with your case suggestion. So in March of 1984, Sherry Lindsay went out to do her paper route, but she never returned. She was brutally murdered. Investigation Discovery's Evil Lives Here, Shadows of Death, The Paper Route, portrays this story behind Sherry's murder. Sherry was the middle child. She had a brother and a sister, and she was living in Binghamton, New York. She loved music and sports, and she was described as a thoughtful young girl. She was working a part-time job delivering newspapers because she wanted to raise money for her teacher's baby shower. So how kind is that? So on March 26th, Sherry went on her route to collect money owed for newspapers. While her mother normally did go with her, this time she stayed home to cook dinner. So I'm sure that haunts her mother to this day. But then the family began to worry when Sherry didn't return. When they were searching for Sherry, Jean told the police about a man who still needed to pay for the week's deliveries, and she had a strange feeling about him and remembered that he looked at her weird. So James Wales, then 35 years old and a father of 2, lived with his family about 7 blocks from Sherry's house. He seemed a bit nervous, and investigators thought his behavior was strange, so he was brought in for questioning. His stepson told the police that Sherry did come into their home on March 26th and that James took her into the cellar, after which he heard screaming and saw some feet up in the air. So Sherry's body was found in that cellar, wrapped in a blanket and covered by wood paneling. James Wales confessed about an hour and a half into his interrogation. He stated that he hit Sherry 2 to 3 times with a stick, which turned out to be a table light. Then after raping the girl, he put a clothesline around her neck and hung her from a pipe before wrapping her body up in a blanket. So poor little Sherry had suffered blunt force trauma, and she had been strangled to death, and of course she'd also been sexually assaulted, so this is a horrible, horrible crime. But I think it is worth looking into.
Yeah, I mean, this guy's obviously mentally ill, raping and strangling a 12-year-old.
Evil. I don't know if that means he's mentally ill. It means he's a psycho pedophile.
Mentally ill.
Okay, well, not mentally ill in the way where he needs treatment, or it could possibly be an excuse for his behavior.
Right.
Which is kind of how I look at it when you say mentally ill.
But that's just such a gruesome crime.
Well, I think anyone who commits murder is mentally ill in some way.
Yeah.
You have to be.
So I hope he's going to be in prison forever.
Yeah. But let's put that on the list of possibilities.
Okay.
Okay. So we have another voicemail from Michael with a case suggestion.
Hi, Dick and Jill. My name is Michael. I have been avidly listening to your podcast, and it's fast become one of my favorites. I listen to it while I'm doing my dog sitting job, and it really helps me feel like there's some people out there who really love true crime as much as I do and want to communicate it in a way that's as accessible as possible. So thank you so much for all the hard work that you do. Something that I wanted to let you know about is the story of Daniel J. LaPlante. He is also referred to as the man who lived in the walls. So he was this adolescent boy who had an obsession with this young woman and basically lived in the walls of her house. I believe he's still alive, but it would just be something really interesting for both y'all to cover. And it's also a spooky one, great for Halloween. Yep. So thank you so much for all your hard work and your good stories and all your beer reviews. They're really interesting. I love stouts particularly. So I love hearing Dick's reviews about stout beer. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Well, thank you, Michael, for all your kind words. Very kind.
I'm always liking a person who lists stouts as their favorite beer.
Oh, absolutely. So this is a case I've heard a bit about. Actually, that Lifetime show Frogging about people living in people's houses. Have we ever discussed that on the podcast? Or
I don't think so.
Okay. Well, it's this freaky show about people living secretly in other people's houses, and they're true stories. So one of the things that was covered was this Daniel LaPlante, the man or the boy who lived in walls. So Daniel LaPlante has become a bit of an urban legend. It was back on December 1st, 1987, when he entered the home of Priscilla Gustafson, a nursery school teacher, and she was later found face down on her bed with her pillows covered in blood. LaPlante had raped her and shot her multiple times at point-blank range, and drowned both of her children, a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old, Abigail and William, in separate bathrooms. But before these murders, Daniel had been found in the home of 2 girls who had recently lost their mother to cancer. And what happened there is items kept coming up missing, and then furniture was moved around. And then the girls heard knocking in their bedroom walls. Now, at first, their father didn't believe them. He thought they were just going through a hard time. They'd lost their mother. But then he saw Daniel standing in the room, dressed in his deceased wife's clothing, makeup, and a wig. So that is spooky. It does sound like a horror movie an awful lot.
That sure does.
Now, apparently he was also holding a hatchet. So Daniel escaped, but then the police found him in a crawl space in the house. And they learned that Daniel had been living in the walls, and there was a passageway leading to other parts of the house. And there were also many peepholes that Daniel had made in the walls. So he was sent to a juvenile facility, and after he was let out, he committed those murders at the Gustafson house. So, really a crazy story.
That is. Holy cow.
It is a good idea for Halloween, too.
Yeah, I'll have to check into that, Michael.
There isn't much creepier, right, than having someone secretly living in your house.
Right.
Ugh, creepy.
Watching you while you sleep at night.
Right, yes. Those poor girls, jeez. And then their dad doesn't believe them in the beginning, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and then he's in a facility, I presume, to look at his mental status.
Yeah.
And he gets released and then kills the people at the Gustafson house.
Right, which is really a horror. It's a horror. Okay, so we just have the one email, and that is from Mary with a case suggestion for the David Owen case.
Yeah, so David Owen was killed in June 2006 in Topeka, Kansas. Written about by Justin Kendall in The Pitch, which is a local Kansas City newspaper magazine. There's articles on The Lonely Guy, March 2006, Dead Man's Camp, February 2007, and a book by Benedict Giamo in 2011, Homeless Come Home, An Advocate, the Riverbank, and Murder in Topeka, Kansas.
Yeah, so tons of references for us to use.
Yeah, and Mary says, don't be fooled by the Pitch's cover. Its writers are excellent. I would read the Pitch articles first. I like the way you take so much time to analyze the characters. Thank you.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Mary.
So David Owen was an advocate for the homeless, and he was a pain in the ass, quite frankly. He was unkempt, he was brash, he was annoyingly persistent, and very abrasive. So he would search Topeka for homeless camps and offer to help those on the streets get back with their families. He'd let them use his cell phone to place calls to family members. Sometimes he would even destroy their homeless camps to induce them to get off the streets.
Well, I don't know if that's the best idea.
Well, it wasn't.
They don't always have some place to go, and some of the shelters are scary. But, you know, it's a good idea to try and help people.
Well, he was a real advocate, but one of his excursions cost him his life. On June 14th, 2006, he came upon a homeless camp where 4 unhoused people were hanging out by the Kansas River. Owen implored them to get in contact with their families. The people, including a woman named Kimberly Sharp, were not receptive to his advice and didn't like him being there. So they beat him, they strung him up to a tree, and left him there to die.
Well, that's horrible. Wow.
So there's another one to look into.
Absolutely, and there's plenty to read on it, so I will read on that, Mary. Thank you so much for including all those references.
So that's it for today, tie grabbers.
That's right. Okay. So thank you so much for listening, for your feedback. Keep it coming in. We need more feedback.
That's right. We like it.
Yep. And we'll see you next time at the Quiet End.
We'll save some seats for you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.